the skin starts to become hard and becomes the shell, the new shell. But before that happens, the lobster takes in an enormous amount of water, thereby expanding itself to its fullest amount. And then, as the shell gets harder, the lobster lets out the water and sort of rattles around inside its new shell. Perfectly good. If it's a female lobster, when it molts is the time it mates. And the male lobster, it's the most extraordinary thing to see, will come over the female and protect it. It does not kill it. It protects, and the female lies there peacefully and contentedly, while the male protects it with its claws, but never hurts it. In that way, the lobster is able to grow. Now, what is so beautiful about it is the fact that we have to believe that the same thing happens to humans. That when the human grows intelligently, emotionally, spiritually, skillfully, at that point, the human is also unprotected and can be invaded and killed. It is in a university setting. Perhaps the university acts as the male, protecting the molted female. Perhaps that is true. But also, it is important for the colleagues, and it's also important for the teacher to protect and defend that helpless creature until it becomes strong again. So perhaps the curriculum does not protect or defend anybody, but it's the individual who does. The teacher is in effect a programmer, and as any other animal, it programs its student to do the same. So what the teacher teaches is patterning. If the teacher is cruel to the student will learn to be cruel to its students. So it's a patterning process. The same way as birds learn from their parents on how to fly, so do students learn by how the teacher behaves, how to behave with their students.
So you're the protector at times for a student?
Most of the time.
While
they are growing.
While they are giving something up.
Oh, yes. And it's during that time that the student cannot grow without being vulnerable. And so the student has to be taught gently that it must not be afraid of being vulnerable.
Some of the so-called old school teachers, I don't know if this applies to Sirkin, but it seems to apply to, like Vengerova.
Mm-hmm.
I just read this book by Gary Graffman that describes her methods. It seems like that approach to teaching is very good in one way, in that it tears down a student's illusions, it tears down their skeleton. But then it would seem that somebody like that moves in and creates the vulnerability, which is good, but then moves in and says, now, do it my way. Am I perceiving that?
I don't know. I didn't read the book of Gary. I didn't read Gary's book. But yeah.
I don't mean to pinpoint Vengerova because I didn't know her and I'm only going by his.
No.
But there is this imperialistic.
Okay. There's also a contradictory thing. That just to send out a student that has been protected from the world is to send out a child onto a freeway. You have to also train the student. You also have to train the person who works with you on how to protect itself. Because if you protect it all the time, it's helpless. So at times when it isn't vulnerable, you never attack it when it's vulnerable. You teach it how to protect itself. You can never teach anyone how to protect itself when it's vulnerable, because there is no way that anyone is that...
It's not vulnerable. It wouldn't be vulnerable.
Then it could never grow.
Yeah.
Oh, you teach it how to fight, but you teach it how to fight when it has its protection, when it knows how to protect.
Mm-hmm.
Do it when it's vulnerable and destroy it.
Did you speak about the fact that you work very much with a student where the student is, starting with where the student is, and that you only add one variable at a time?
Oh yes, this is quite true. You never add more than one variable at any one time, because when you do two, the person is too disturbed. Let them learn one thing, then go on to the next. If you ask them to do a multiplicity of things, the only thing that can happen is frustration, anger, and inability to do. Oh yes, these are all teaching processes.
Concretely, what would that mean if you were beginning with a student that was at wherever they were at, and let's say they didn't get around the keyboard so good? What new variable would you put in?
I'd find out what the strong point of the student is and develop that.
What about the weak points?
They generally take care of themselves, because once the strong is developed, if there's a weak point, the person generally finds out what the weak point is and tries to develop it himself or herself. If they can't, then they come ask me, and then we work on one weak point at a time, but constantly developing the strongest part of the person.
Does that mean leaning towards certain kinds of repertoire, usually?
Not necessarily. It can be anything.
Or do you mean just some aspect of their personality, of them?
Suppose the person had good fingers, but couldn't read too well. I would try to get that person to develop their fingers even more, and then start to add a lot of music. The person will have to learn to read. If the person still can't read, then what I will do is ask that person to continue to perform and spend more time reading. Let us say that the person is unable to understand separation of voices. I will ask that person to play the two voices, say, in one hand. I will ask them to do it in two hands. The one hand in two hands. So they get the sound, and then they can do it. But each student is totally different. And that's where the art of teaching is, that you find out what is the way the student will develop. And you find out that each student is totally different, and you have to work with each student on a totally different basis. You cannot develop, after all, a methodology. Because if you try to use a methodology what you're using is the bed of Procrustes. And that's no way to teach. So you work with each person as though that person were the only person, and that's it.
Have you talked at all about the importance of the use of manuscript?
Oh no, I haven't.
And the way in which you enable a student to have the courage of making interpretations and understanding literature within the framework of going back to the manuscript facsimiles, rather than taking one edition over another. I mean, this is such a fundamental part of your particular way of teaching that is really uniquely yours. That
you have photostats?
I have probably.
Extraordinary.
Can I see some?
Sure.
Let's get one. Can we get one and look at it?
You name it. What would you like?
Something of, you have a Beethoven sonata?
Which
Bob,
one do you want?
which one do you want?
Such a choice. Opus 26.
I think I have it.
A flat.
A flat.
All right, so what do you see there?
What do I see?
That you might not see in the Henley?
First of all, if you look at a score, this is, by the way, one of the better copies of Beethoven manuscript, you'll see something interesting. Andante con variazioni. It's in 3/8. All right, so that's in a Henley score. Piano, that's in a Henley score. But what isn't in the Henley score is that it's not bum bottom. It's bum bottom. There is a space between this note and this.
Oh.
And the composer is not that stupid that he does not realize that space between notes is important. So if you go dum bottom, you may have the unfortunate experience of not following this passionate phrase. So it's bum bum
You're doing a little handwriting analysis.
Exactly.
You're looking into Beethoven's subconscious.
Into his.
Because he knew that it would be printed.
That's right.
Without that space.
Without that. It's not There isn't a thing in here that he has not written, including the phrasing for the left hand. Therefore, this is not phrased. This is phrased. Although he'll phrase here, he does not make the phrase in here. He doesn't only put one staccato in, he wants it, all of them.
Does it mean something that it goes up here, do you think?
No, but what it does mean is that this will continue a staccato motion here, whereas the left hand will not have that staccato motion. And the left hand is so that there isn't that kind of this dramatic thing, but a legato passage here which will have as opposed to thereby giving you both a continuation of sound and a staccato at the same time. No editorializing, just simply the way he did it. The left hand doesn't have any phrasing. Left hand still doesn't have any phrasing. It's not a fast one. And the phrase does not come from the C, but comes from the B flat. So, in other words, how he has written this thing actually determines the style of the piece, which is where the word stilos, this handwriting, determines the way the piece is played.
Mm-hmm.
So the style of the composer is his handwriting. So,
where did you, how can you get these?
Beethoven House in Bonn. It's curious. You don't have to have the original.
It really gives you a picture that you don't, an image that you don't get of it.
That's correct. And this is where the investigation becomes extremely interesting. Now, if you want to see some really interesting things, I'll show you in Brahms and in Beethoven. Come on in, and you've got enough for come on in, we'll have fun. Oh, I decided that it was about time we changed some of the notions of concerts. What I did was, it was for a group of students, and I said, instead of having a concert in which I sit here and play for you, why don't I put the music up on the rack? I don't have to look at it. I have it in manuscript here. Why don't you come on up and watch and listen and become a part of the scene? Because I believe that what we have now on stage is a static situation. So part of the audience came up to watch, and they became a part of the scene. Now, it became interesting because what we have is stage sets, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are generally painted or rigid or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But suppose the stage were living.
Mm-hmm.
And I got that notion from rock concerts, because the person gets up there and starts to sing, but what's happening in the background, the stage set, is living and moving. So the person only has to just stand there. And since the set is moving, constantly in actions, constantly doing
What do you
something.
mean, the other singers jumping around?
The instrumentalists, everybody jiggling and moving, so that the stage itself is alive. The singer doesn't have to do that much. How much what we have in concerts is that the stage is set, is fixed. And since the instrument is fixed, and since the pianist is fixed, what we have is a static medium without anything happening. So by inviting the kids up, they became a movable stage that was constantly in action.
Some of them were sitting, some of them were kneeling, some of them
I didn't tell them how to
standing.
do anything. I just invited them up. Put the manuscript, I said, you want to see what the manuscript looks like? Stuck the manuscript up and continued on to play. And this was, as a result, it was an extraordinary experience. This is why concertos or symphony concerts are good, because there's a kind of movement. It's when the orchestra becomes static and doesn't move, and the only thing that's moving is the conductor.
Yeah.
What we have then is a focus on only one thing that's moving, and so therefore, once again, a static medium. I would rather have the orchestra moving and the conductor standing quietly.
So how did it feel to you up there?
I had a ball.
They were actively participating, and it was. I was sitting in the audience, and I watched
There were
the
still
kids.
people left in the
Oh yes, the majority. I would say that in a hall that seated about 350 people, which was virtually full, that maybe 50 were on the stage watching, maybe 40, and it was almost like being present at a seance, because as the students were watching the score and they were hearing it come to life, the people in the audience were also transfixed by being a part of this process of seeing it come to life.
In other words, the
A
process.
lot of energy up there, right?
In other words, it wasn't the medium that was the message. It was the process that was the message.
There were two works that he did. One was a Beethoven, and the other one, interestingly enough, was the Mussorgsky pictures. And there he not only had the score on the stage in the handwriting of Mussorgsky, but the reproductions of the pictures.
By Victor Hartmann.
That's correct. Which were visible to the entire audience while the thing was going on, as well as to the kids who were crowded
In
around.
other words,
Get rid of that there's a barrier that you got rid of.
that's right. Come on, let's go.